In 1478, a member of the English royal family was executed in the most unbelievable way documented in history, drowned in a barrel of wine. It's not a myth, it's not an exaggeration, and yes, he asked for it. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother of King Edward IV, died at age 28 inside a massive barrel containing 105 gallons of Malmsey wine. This wasn't some accident, some medieval tragedy where someone accidentally fell into a vat during a feast. No, this was an execution, a calculated, deliberate and horrifyingly unique execution. And the strangest part, according to several chroniclers of the time, George himself chose this method. But before we understand why a royal prince would choose to die drowning in wine, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when England was tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war, where brothers became enemies and crowns were won and lost in rivers of blood. This is the story of ambition, betrayal, paranoia, and one of the most bizarre deaths in all of human history. And before you think this is just another medieval tragedy, let me warn you, what George does next is so catastrophic, so self-destructive, that historians still struggle to understand it, and it all leads directly to that barrel. Before we dive into this brutally fascinating story, make sure to subscribe. We bring you the darkest, strangest, and most unbelievable tales from real history every week. George Plantagenet was born on October 21st, 1449, in Dublin, Ireland. He was the third surviving son of Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, a woman from one of the most powerful families in northern England. George grew up in a world of privilege, but also of constant danger. But the moment that set his downfall in motion happened long before the wine. It began right here in his childhood, with a lesson burned into him. Trust no one, not even your own blood. His father was not just any nobleman. Richard of York believed he had a better claim to the English throne than King Henry VI, who belonged to the rival House of Lancaster. This dispute between York and Lancaster would explode into what history knows as the Wars of the Roses, a series of devastating civil wars that would last for decades and consume entire generations of English nobility. Young George's childhood was marked by violence and uncertainty. In 1459, when George was just 10 years old, his father and older brothers were forced to flee England after a failed rebellion. George was left behind with his mother, his older sister Margaret, and his younger brother Richard. He watched as a royal army sacked their home in Ludlow. He learned early that power was everything and loyalty was fragile. But fortune turned. In 1461, George's older brother Edward managed to defeat the Lancastrian forces and claim the throne as Edward IV. George was just 11 years old, and suddenly his brother was King of England. The day after Edward's coronation, on June 29, 1461, George was created Duke of Clarence. And from that moment on, George stopped thinking like a prince and started thinking like a future king. It was an ancient and prestigious title, previously held by sons of kings. George was also invested as a Knight of the Garter, one of the highest honours in England. For the next 9 years, George would be his brother's heir, the second most important person in the kingdom. But that position came with a terrible burden. He was always one heartbeat away from ultimate power, yet that power might be snatched away at any moment if Edward had a son. This is where George's personality begins to reveal itself. He was intelligent, charming, and ambitious, but he was also volatile, petulant, and obsessed with his rights and status. Growing up in a position of such potential power, yet with no real control, made George dangerous. He began to resent his brother. He began to think he deserved more. And then came the worst influence possible, the one man capable of turning George's resentment into rebellion. And he began to listen to people who whispered that perhaps he should be king instead. The man who most influenced George was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known throughout England as the Kingmaker. Warwick was George's first cousin, and he had been instrumental in putting Edward on the throne. But by the late 1460s, Warwick's relationship with King Edward had soured. The king was making his own decisions, ignoring Warwick's advice, and worst of all, he had married Elizabeth Woodville, a woman Warwick considered completely unsuitable. Elizabeth was a widow from a minor noble family, not a foreign princess who could bring alliances and wealth. Warwick was furious. He had plans for Edward to marry a French princess, plans that would have increased Warwick's own power immensely. But Edward had married in secret, following his heart instead of political necessity. Warwick felt betrayed and humiliated, and he began to plot. He turned to George. In 1469, despite Edward's explicit prohibition, George married Isabel Neville, Warwick's eldest daughter, in Calais. This wasn't just a marriage. It was a declaration of rebellion. George and Warwick were now family, and they were now allies against the king. Shortly after the wedding, they launched a rebellion. They captured Edward and held him prisoner. For a brief moment, it seemed George might actually become king. But the rebellion collapsed. Edward was too popular, too strong, and too clever. He regained his freedom and his throne. George returned to the fold, and Edward forgave him. It was the first betrayal, but it wouldn't be the last. If the story ended here, George would be remembered as a traitor, but what he does next turns him into something much darker. By 1470, the situation had deteriorated again. Warwick's ambitions had not died. This time, he made an even more audacious plan. He would ally with Margaret of Anjou, the wife of the deposed Lancastrian king Henry VI, and restore Henry to the throne. Warwick promised George that he would be the heir to the throne after Henry's son, Prince Edward of Westminster. George, blinded by ambition and resentment toward his brother, agreed. In September 1470, Edward was forced to flee England. Henry VI was taken out of the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned and restored to the throne. For 6 months, England had a Lancastrian king again. George was now theoretically in line for the crown, but something changed. George realized that Warwick had no intention of making him king. The Earl was focused on consolidating power for himself and for Prince Edward of Westminster, who would marry Warwick's younger daughter, Anne. George was being used, sidelined, treated as a pawn rather than a prince. So George made a decision that shocked even Warwick, a betrayal so sudden that it changed the entire war. He had betrayed his own brother for nothing. So George did what he did best. He switched sides again. In December 1470, George secretly contacted Edward and offered to return to the Yorkist cause. Edward remarkably agreed. He needed all the support he could get. In April 1471, the brothers were reunited. George fought alongside Edward at the decisive battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. Warwick was killed at Barnet. Prince Edward of Westminster was killed at Tewkesbury. Henry VI died mysteriously in the Tower shortly afterward, almost certainly murdered. Edward was king again, and the House of York seemed secure. George was restored to royal favour. He inherited much of the Warwick fortune through his wife Isabel. He should have been satisfied, but he wasn't. The years that followed were marked by increasing paranoia and instability on George's part. His wife Isabel died in December 1476 during childbirth, possibly from tuberculosis or childbed fever, but George was convinced she had been poisoned. He blamed one of her ladies-in-waiting, a woman named Anchoret Twinhoe. Without any real trial, without any real evidence, George had Anchoret arrested, dragged to Warwick, and forced a jury to convict her of murder by poisoning. She was hanged immediately. The woman was innocent. She was posthumously pardoned in 1478 by King Edward, but by then it was too late. George's mental state, never particularly stable, was deteriorating rapidly. He began to spread rumours that Edward was illegitimate, that their mother, Cecily Neville, had had an affair with a soldier, and that Edward was not the true son of Richard of York. He claimed that Edward had used witchcraft to bewitch his subjects. He had some of his servants swear personal loyalty to him, not to the king, and sent them across the kingdom to stir up rebellion. He was spiraling into madness, fueled by grief, paranoia, and a lifetime of frustrated ambition. This was the beginning of the end. Everything that happens next points straight to that barrel of wine. The final breaking point came in 1477. One of George's household members, an astronomer from Oxford named John Stacey, was arrested and accused of trying to kill the king using black magic and necromancy. Under torture, Stacey confessed. He was executed at Tyburn for treason. George, in an act of astonishing stupidity and defiance, appointed a former Lancastrian supporter named Dr. John Goddard to proclaim Stacey's innocence before Parliament. By defending a convicted traitor, George was now himself guilty of treason. Edward had reached his limit. He summoned George to Windsor and denounced him for serious misconduct. George was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. In January 1478, Parliament began proceedings against George. A bill of attainder was passed, declaring him guilty of unnatural and loathsome treasons. The charges were extensive. George had sent his heir abroad. He had kept documents supporting his claim to the throne, based on the Lancastrian line. He had made his servants swear loyalty to him over the king. He had claimed Edward was illegitimate. He had slandered the king repeatedly. Most damning of all, he had prepared for armed rebellion. Edward himself prosecuted his brother before Parliament. It was an extraordinary and tragic scene. One brother, a king, standing before the assembled lords and commons, demanding the death of another brother, a duke. The trial was a foregone conclusion. George's fate was sealed, but the method of his death was not, and what he chose no one in England had ever witnessed before. George was found guilty of high treason. The punishment for treason was death, but Edward hesitated. For weeks, he delayed the execution. Some chroniclers say he regretted his decision, that he was torn apart by the conflict between his duty as a king and his love as a brother. Others suggest that Queen Elizabeth Woodville, who had never forgotten George's previous betrayals and his support for Warwick, pushed Edward to proceed. She feared George would always be a threat to her children's claim to the throne. Parliament eventually forced Edward's hand. The execution was scheduled for February 18th, 1478. Now we come to the strangest part of this story. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother of the king, was not beheaded. That was the traditional method of execution for nobility. It was quick, relatively painless if done correctly, and considered honorable. But George was not beheaded. When his body was later exhumed, his head was found intact, still attached to his body. So how did he die? Prepare yourself, because this is where the story becomes almost unbearable. According to multiple sources from the time, including chronicles and later historical accounts, George was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. A butt was a large barrel used for storing and transporting wine. It held approximately 105 gallons, or 477 liters. That's enough liquid to completely submerge a grown man. Malmsey was an expensive, sweet wine, highly prized in England. In George's time, it likely came from Greece. Though later it would be associated with Madeira, it was George's favorite drink. Some sources claim that George requested this method of execution himself, that when he was given the choice of how he would die, he chose to be drowned in his beloved Malmsey wine. Why would anyone choose such a death? There are several theories. One is that George wanted to avoid having his blood spilled. In some medieval cultures, there was a belief that spilling royal blood was particularly sinful or dangerous. Drowning was considered a cleaner death in that sense. Another theory is that George was mocking his brother Edward, who was known for his own heavy drinking and indulgent lifestyle. By choosing to die in wine, George was making a final, bitter joke. A third possibility is that George simply wanted to die in a way that would never be forgotten, a death so bizarre and shocking that it would echo through history. If that was his goal, he succeeded spectacularly. The execution was carried out in private, in the Bowyer Tower within the Tower of London. This was where high-ranking prisoners were kept. Edward had no intention of making a public spectacle of his brother's death. The shame was too great, the family division too painful. But what actually happened in that room? The most detailed account comes from later literary sources, particularly William Shakespeare's play Richard III, written more than a century later. In Shakespeare's version, George is first stabbed and then drowned in the wine. But Shakespeare was writing drama, not history. He was also writing under the Tudor dynasty, which had its own reasons to vilify the Yorkist kings. The historical reality is more uncertain. What we know is this: George was executed privately. His body was intact, not beheaded, and very soon after his death, rumors began to spread that he had been drowned in wine. These rumors were not dismissed as fantasy. They were repeated by chroniclers, by courtiers, by people who would have known the truth. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from George's own daughter, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. She survived her father's execution and lived until 1541, when she herself was executed by Henry VIII. A portrait believed to be of Margaret Pole shows her wearing a charm bracelet on her right wrist, and on that bracelet is a small silver barrel. Why would the daughter of the Duke of Clarence wear a barrel charm for the rest of her life, unless it commemorated the way her father died? That single piece of jewelry has convinced many historians that the wine drowning was real. But how would such an execution actually work? The mechanics are grimmer than you might think. A butt of wine is enormous. It would have been rolled into George's cell by executioners, probably a headsman and his apprentice, as some accounts suggest. The men would have been masked, as was traditional. They would have told George it was time. Perhaps George joked, as one chronicle suggests, trying to mask his fear. Perhaps he laughed with his mouth open wide, already gasping for air, as his face turned white with terror. Then they would have forced him into the barrel. A grown man, a prince, struggling or perhaps submitting, pushed headfirst into the dark, sweet liquid. The wine would have filled his nose, his mouth, his lungs. He would have thrashed, trying to find air, but there was none. The fumes from the wine alone can knock someone unconscious. The wine was thick, sweet, and suffocating. A liquid coffin. Death by drowning is agonizing. It takes minutes. George would have felt every second of it, the burning in his lungs, the panic, the desperate need to breathe, and then finally silence. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother of a king, died at age 28 inside a barrel of wine. His body was later removed, cleaned, and sent to Tewkesbury Abbey for burial in an expensive tomb funded by Edward. Some have suggested that the wine drowning story originated as a dark joke after George's death, a reference to his well-known fondness for drinking. Others propose that his body was transported to Tewkesbury in a barrel of wine to preserve it, similar to how Admiral Horatio Nelson's body was later sent home in a barrel of brandy. But these explanations don't account for the immediate spread of the rumor, for the daughter's bracelet, for the private nature of the execution that allowed for such an unusual method. If you're still here, you're exactly the type of person who loves dark, shocking history. So pay close attention. The final twist of this story is even stranger. Edward IV reportedly grieved deeply for his brother after the execution. He funded George's funeral, paid for his tomb, and established a chantry foundation in his name. Some historians believe Edward was pushed into the execution by his wife and other courtiers, that he never truly wanted his brother dead. Others argue that Edward had no choice, that George's repeated treasons and increasingly unstable behavior made him too dangerous to live. The truth, as with so much of medieval history, is probably somewhere in between. What we do know is that George's execution haunted Edward for the rest of his life. He died just 5 years later, in 1483, at the age of only 40. And with Edward's death, the kingdom was plunged into chaos again. Edward's young sons, the princes in the Tower, disappeared under mysterious circumstances. likely murdered by their uncle Richard, who became Richard III. The Wars of the Roses continued until 1485, when Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and Henry Tudor became Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. George's children suffered terribly. His son, Edward Plantagenet, was executed by Henry VII in 1499 to eliminate any Yorkist claim to the throne. His daughter, Margaret Pole, lived longer, but was eventually executed by Henry VIII in 1541 in one of the most brutal executions in English history. She was 67 years old when they dragged her to the block, and according to legend, she refused to lay her head down and had to be chased around the scaffold by the executioner. The Clarence bloodline was virtually wiped out, victims of the endless power struggles of the age. So why does the story of George, Duke of Clarence, drowned in a barrel of wine, continue to fascinate us more than 500 years later? Perhaps because it represents the absolute extremes of human ambition and folly. George had everything: royal blood, wealth, titles, privilege. He was one of the most powerful men in England, but it wasn't enough. He wanted the crown. He wanted to be king, and that ambition destroyed him. His story is a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, of betrayal, of jealousy and paranoia. But it's also a story about family, about two brothers who should have been allies but became enemies, about a king who loved his brother but was forced to kill him, about the impossible choices that power demands, and it's a story about how we choose to die. If George really did request to be drowned in wine, what does that tell us about him? Was it defiance? Was it mockery? Was it despair? Was it a final attempt to control something, anything in a life that had spiraled completely out of his control? We'll never know for certain. The records are incomplete. The truth is lost to time. But the image remains. A prince, a brother, a traitor, drowning in a barrel of his favorite wine, gasping for air that would never come, dying one of the strangest deaths in all of recorded history. And that image has echoed through the centuries. Shakespeare immortalized it in his play. Novelists like Philippa Gregory have explored it in their books. Historians continue to debate it. And we, sitting here centuries later, are still shocked, still horrified, still fascinated by the sheer absurdity and tragedy of it. But the question remains, why does this death stay with us? Why does it haunt the imagination? This story reminds us that history is not just dates and battles and kings. It's human, it's messy, it's full of people making terrible decisions, driven by emotions we still understand today: ambition, fear, jealousy, love, revenge. The Middle Ages were brutal in ways we can barely imagine. Life was short, death was everywhere, and power was the only thing that mattered. But even in that brutal world, even among people who saw violence every day, George's death stood out. It was shocking then, and it remains shocking now. So the next time you pour yourself a glass of wine, remember George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. Remember that 547 years ago, a prince of England drowned in a barrel of it, a death so bizarre that it seems like fiction but is documented by history. Remember that ambition can be as intoxicating and as deadly as any wine. And remember that in the end, no matter how high you rise, no matter how much power you have, fate can drown you in the very thing you loved most. That's the legacy of George, Duke of Clarence. A cautionary tale written in wine and blood, a story that refuses to be forgotten, a death that defines absurdity and tragedy in equal measure. And now you know the truth behind one of history's strangest executions. If this story shocked you, if it made you think, if you want to hear more incredible and disturbing tales from history, make sure you subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with anyone who loves history as strange and dark as this. Because history is full of secrets, full of horrors, full of stories that sound impossible but are absolutely true, and we're here to tell them all.